Hello, everybody. My name is Dianna Rose. Thank you for having me today. I am a vegetation. Specifically, I do our inventory and analysis for natural resources stewardship. So this talk, I'm going to be talking to you today about our Bird Community Index, or BCI for short. This whole title is a fancy way of saying that. We're going to be talking about birds for the next 45 minutes. Oh, maybe not. All right. Does it still have a pointer? Yep. Cool. So we're kind of going to go over like a general introduction to Montgomery Parks, as well as get a little bit into methodology, how we set it up, some of the results we're getting already, and the analytics side of things as well. And at the end, we'll kind of wrap up with future directions and how you might be able to participate if you're interested. Some important terms to know, I'll kind of be using these hopefully sparingly throughout, but GIS references Geographic Information Systems. Esri is a company that we use for mapping software. BCI is the Bird Community Index, and Power BI is just a Microsoft supported platform for business information. It's basically like an analytics software that we use. So you'll see some screenshots from that as well. A little bit about Montgomery Parks. You all, I assume, live in this county, so you probably have heard of Montgomery Parks before, but this is kind of a bird's eye view. So as you know, we're located just north of DC, and kind of as we move through the county from south to north, it's an urban gradient environment, meaning in the southern area, you'll notice it is densely populated, but as we get into the ag reserve, it's a lot more open fields, rolling hills, a lot more natural area. And these are some of the statistics for our county parks. We have about 37,000 acres, and of that, roughly 26,000 is natural area. So to give you an idea, we are a staff of about 12 people in natural resources. So I am also the only inventory and analysis person. So to kind of cover all that area, this project started as how do we get the most analysis and like start understanding what habitat we have without having to survey every single inch of parkland. So this right here is our parks mission statement. And you'll notice one of the top three things is the balance for and demand for recreation with conservation. So what does that mean and how do we get there is part of this project. You know, we focus on the conservation arm in my group, and we focus on both like developing parks, but also how to do that sustainably. So how can we conserve while we're developing at the same time? And this project started to arise because we need to be able to do that with, again, the limited number of staff. So why a bird surveying program other than birds are great and we all love birds? When we started looking at this, we really wanted to be able to utilize something called bird species guilds. So you can look at what birds are being observed and how they utilize the environment, and then make inferences on the habitat that is there based on what birds are there. That'll make a little more sense when I explain guilds in a couple slides. But we're also looking at utilizing Maryland State Wildlife Action Plan and determining land use impacts and targeting species of greatest conservation need and how they're utilizing the landscape as well. Methodology. So we decided to do point counts. The biggest reason we did point counts is because it kind of goes with a lot of existing bird survey protocols. And we're also kind of hoping that this data can be comparable to other bigger national data sets. So point counts is kind of the standard that everybody uses. We're following 5-minute point counts, but we also break those up into the first 3 minutes versus a total 5 minutes. And they are fixed points every single year. I will say we finished up our first 3 years, which was considered a pilot, where we pretty much took results to the bosses and said, this is worthwhile and you should let us keep doing this. And this is where we're going. But we also stratified habitat and made sure to cover every habitat type we possibly could in the parks that we surveyed. And we're hoping to be able to submit some of this data to the continent-wide breeding bird survey as well. That's another reason we used point counts. That's our buddy Ryan Butler up there. So we utilized highly skilled volunteers. So we have some members actually from the bird club are some of our volunteers. We have master naturalists. We have people submit applications and resumes, as well as doing kind of like a fun bird quiz to be like, how good do you know your birds? It's in the May to June timeframe. So far in the first 3 years, we've gotten over 20,000 observations, and we've recorded over 128 distinct species across about 12 parks so far. It's like, there we go. Determining where we did these surveys. So this is an example of the variety of habitat that we're trying to cover. So this park is Bennett Creek Conservation Park, located just north of Damascus. It's about a 400-acre park. And we wanted to be sure that all of these special habitats were getting surveyed in some way to see, could we use guilds to distinguish these habitat types on the ground and kind of extrapolate quality based on what birds we were observing. So when we were putting the points on a map, you can see this is an example of the points here. So we wanted to make sure they were greater, no more than 250 meters apart, so that we could infer independence of observations and that we weren't getting repeat birds, even though they move. And we also use distance bands. So volunteers would record what birds they heard within 50 meters and then what they could say was outside 50 meters. So the whole point in doing that is down the road, we're hoping to start measuring population abundance in some of these areas to kind of determine species trends over time, similar to what the breeding bird atlas does. So this was a labor of love. So this is an example of habitat guilds. So what I was inferring earlier, we compiled a database based on guilds like nesting guilds, residency status, and foraging guilds. This was all based on peer-reviewed literature papers that we had found. And an example of this would be all of these up here. I'm trying to see, I used a white-eyed vireo earlier. So this is during the breeding time frame. A white-eyed vireo is an insectivore, which would be your food type. And they feed in the lower canopy, which would be substrate, and they're gleaner, which would be technique. So when it's broken down into guilds like that, you can have multiple species that feed like that and then make inferences based on what they're using. So some of these might be ground foraging species. So you can infer that the ground cover is good quality in a certain area. We're going to get a little more into actual practical use because this seems a little abstract from the large view. This is a little intense, but we did look into as well species richness and diversity because we are interested in what are the most productive sites that we have and where should we be focusing more of our conservation efforts based on what's already high quality. How can we enhance what's already there and already really good, and potentially where do we need to focus some management efforts as well. When it came to analytics, our volunteers were fantastic. So they did paper survey recordings as well as submitting to a Google shared sheet. So everybody had basically a sheet in Excel where they submitted all of their observations because it was easiest for us really, because we then put that into our GIS systems, which then talks to the Power BI. So basically there's all this background stuff that no one really cares about, but it's the easiest way to get from Excel paper sheets to actual answers, usable answers for us. Some program highlights. So as I said earlier, in the first 3 years, we had over 20,000 individuals recorded to date. 40 of those species are listed or species of greatest conservation need. We have 3 years of data, and since then we've also been approved to extend for the next 3 years. So we're targeting, I think, 12 more parks and 139 sites in the upcoming 3 years. One thing I kind of glossed over, in these surveys, we also do acoustic analysis because some of these parks do not have trails. Some of them are really hard to access. We do have a couple volunteers who are willing to go off trail. There are very brave volunteers. And then we also deploy acoustic monitors, which still do the 5-minute surveys that we then randomize subsampling from. And we have people listen to the acoustics to get that data. And surprisingly, we actually get more species off that when you would think some of the obvious species that you observe visually, like turkey vulture or red-shouldered hawk, like that you would typically see visually, those, even though they weren't captured in the acoustics, we were still getting greater species observed in those remote areas on acoustics than we were visual surveys. This is a snapshot of that Power BI dashboard I was telling you about. So this is kind of like our landing page. The really important stuff is kind of up here at the top. So you'll see the number of individuals, distinct species. This herd species is specifically acoustic numbers that were only caught audibly versus observed is ones that were seen in person, recorded by a person visually. And you can see all of the parks we've done here. I don't know why this map, but you can see all the parks we observed here and the number of birds that were observed at those parks. An easier way to do this, we're just going to go through some species-specific examples with the guilds to kind of give you a practical idea of how we're using this and what it means. So this species here is a field sparrow, which is a species of greatest conservation need, and they rely on forb-dominated meadows. So when we're looking at presence or absence of a species, this is a species that when we see, this is North Branch 2-3, and you'll notice it is almost entirely are inferring that it is, the meadow is healthy enough to be supporting field sparrows, which is part of the management goals when we're at a site like this. Like we will have a list of species that says, okay, we're managing for a forb-dominated meadow. These are the species that we want to see. And this is the data supporting that. This is another park. This is Rachel Carson Conservation Park, and you'll notice the complete absence of points outside of that meadow. So that is also what we want to see. The absence of a species is telling us just as much as the presence of a species. The next few slides are going to focus on two particular parks. The one on the left is Blockhouse Point Conservation Park, and the one on the right is that North Branch 2-3 Meadow Complex. And the reason I chose these, North Branch is the largest meadow complex in the county. It's around 200 acres, which is huge for a meadow complex in this county that we own. And Blockhouse Point is almost entirely forested, around 600 acres, and very intact forest interior habitat. So when we're looking at some of these other guilds, we also looked at things like forest interior obligate species. And these pie charts, the gray is the absence of those species, whereas the red in the pie charts is the presence. So you'll notice most of the points in Blockhouse have a significant number of those forest interior obligates, which we want to see compared to these meadow sites, which basically have none. But you do notice some of these forest sites are supporting forest interior obligates at North Branch. We can also look at things like food type. So granivores, in this case, are really going to be species that focus on seeds. So we would expect to see more of those in a meadow habitat, which you can see down here, it's predominantly granivore species. Whereas in the forested type, we're not really getting many of those, but we wouldn't expect to see them at that site. Last view kind of on this. So this is a comprehensive look at type. So this clues us in more on the structure of habitat that we're seeing, like physically. So you'll notice the North Branch site, even these pie charts are hard to read, but if you focus on the bar graphs up at the top, there's a significantly larger number of nesters in the meadow area compared to Blockhouse has significantly more canopy nesters and cavity nesters. And a lot of this, you might be sitting in your seat saying, well, duh, that like makes sense. That's what you're managing for. To date, we didn't have any numbers to support that these habitats we're managing were providing for the species that we were expecting. We pretty much didn't have anything to back it up other than, well, they should be here. So this was actually giving us the data we need to support like, hey, we're effectively managing what we have and what we're conserving. Bueller? Okay. Another thing that we have been looking at is on trail versus off trail. So does presence or absence of a trail influence the diversity of bird species that we're observing at a site? So this is Rachel Carson Conservation Park. Claire, I think you're online there. Thank you for surveying this. You did a great job. This red is the on-trail sites and the gray is off-trail. So in this way, we started to be interested in, we designed the structure and methodology so that we could ask multiple questions of this data set, both now and in the future. We wanted it to be the biggest bang for our buck that we could get without having to completely resurvey these every single time. So we're starting to look at what does trail use mean and how can we better plan some of these parks and give people access while conserving these bird species. I have an even better example of this in a couple slides, so I'll just kind of gloss over that. Go ahead. Yes, so circle size was, let's see if I can go back. I guess I can't. Circle size was indicative of number of species observed. And that was thank you. That was a cumulative summary over time. So you'll notice like this meadow site and some of these interior ones had a lot more species than some of these. Those are actually pretty good forest right there. So I'm not sure why those are showing up so low. Yes, so red is on trail where gray is off trail. So in that sense, we were defining trails as if a point was located greater than 50 meters away from a trail, it was considered off trail. Because we were considering within 50 meters to be trail influenced. It's kind of buffering it. Yeah. So the ones on, most of the ones on trail here, like in this center area of the park, were done by a person, so visually, as well as like someone standing for 5 minutes and recording. And then this area that is completely west of Zion Road was done with acoustic monitors. Yeah. So there is a difference in sampling. So we were trying to get rid of some of the sampling bias and using acoustics versus people because the number of observations that we have. So since they were surveyed 3 times a year for 3 years, that's 9 times, and then you times it by 5, and then it just gets kind of bigger and bigger by the number of samples that we have. Say again? Yep, maybe dropping food. Yeah. People. So we tried using Kaleidoscope, Merlin ID, and a couple other softwares, but the technology isn't quite up to snuff yet with getting certain species through. So it was just easier to send those recordings to some of our volunteers and be like, hey, can you tell us what you hear in this 5-minute recording? Write it down, submit it. So there's also a difference in, you're not necessarily getting species quantity, you're just getting presence absence with acoustics. So we have to use a different analysis when we start including acoustic data versus just in-person data, if that makes sense. So we're trying to, again, this is a bang for your buck kind of thing where it's like some data was better than no data for us because a lot of these places had no data at all. And kind of to drive that point home about guilds and presence and absence and what that means kind of in the large scheme of like planning parks and what we do with that information. This is a barred owl. So a barred owl is identified by MDNR's Chesapeake Bay critical areas as a forest interior obligate species that prefers high quality forest interior based on the acreage and type of forest that they need. So when we start observing these barred owls during the breeding period, we can infer that they use tree cavities, right? So then we can start inferring, well, if they need tree cavities and they're here, we're going to get other species that are associated with tree cavity use, like bats and specific insects and raccoons. But their absence also tells us a significant amount about the habitat as well. So if barred owls aren't there and we have forest interior that we thought was high quality, what does that mean? Is the park maybe too busy in this area? Does it mean it's degraded and we didn't know it? Does it also mean that we need to make better management decisions about developing on the edge of a forest and lighting policy? We have all these policies in parks that can be impacted by something like this. This is, we're going to get a little sciencey for 2 slides. I won't bog you down too much with this, but forest interior analysis is one of the specific statistics we did to kind of take to our bosses to be like, this is worthwhile, this is real citizen science, and this is going to change how we do business. So when we looked at forest interiors, we used the guidelines set forth by DNR because that was done in the early 2000s. And we were just kind of assuming that their numbers, it's something like it's a minimum of 50 acres with a 300-foot buffer on the edge of a forest, and it meets 10, it's very specific, but we were going off of their guidelines without really any proof that, hey, forest interior obligate species are using this habitat. So we started identifying our points as being, it's weird terminology, but non-forest interior forest, you could kind of think of like edge forest that's within that 300 feet of the edge of a forest. And then forest interior forest is within the guidelines put forth by DNR. So points were classified as one of the 2, excluding meadow sites entirely. And then looking at, I use the term FIDS here, which is forest interior dwelling species, which is identified again in that document I mentioned. So what we're trying to see is there a significant association between forest type and FIDS observed? And no surprise, DNR had it right. Thank goodness we've been using the right stuff for years. But what this also means is when we start developing parks or changing, like we do a lot of natural surface trail reroutes. So when we're rerouting a trail, we might say, we're going to give guidance and say, okay, you need to stay out of this significant section of forest interior because of these answers right here. This is giving us the answer we need to say, you guys need to stay out of there. Go ahead. Can you say it again? Well, let's go back so we can look at what you're saying. So you're saying the non-FIDS here, is this what you're talking about? Yes, because that is not forest interior habitat. So we would expect a lot more species that aren't forest interior dwelling. So even though, yeah, so if you look at this going down vertically, this is the number of non-forest are pretty much, as you said, equally high. You'll notice they're a bit higher in forest interior, but if you just look at the column, this is the number that minimum. You'll notice, yeah, they decrease a lot when you get out of forest interior. So this, yeah, so it's a chi-square test. So technically it does look at ratios, but you'll notice the number of FIDS in here. The test is to determine, is there a significant difference between these right here, between those 2 proportions and numbers. It goes into a lot more intense math than that, but that's kind of the gist of it. So one more super sciencey slide. I promise this will be the last one with statistics. So this is looking at more of that on-trail versus off-trail observation that I'd kind of alluded to earlier. So we were looking at this graph probably does it most justice over here. When you do a t-test, you're looking at, do the means of 2 groups overlap or are they significantly, right? So you'll notice that this is a frequency distribution of the total number of species observed per site per year. The blue is on and the green is off trail frequency. And you notice these mound shapes are what we call normal distribution. And when you're running a t-test, that kind of peak of the mound, you're looking at it to be what you really want is if there's a significant difference, you don't want those peaks to be in line with each other. You want them to be far enough away to say it's significant. So the higher the p-value, like the closer to 1, the less significant that difference is, whereas the smaller the p-value is, the greater that difference is. So in this case, we're able to say that, like, yes, there is a significant difference between on-trail versus off-trail species diversity observations. And you'll notice that the off-trail frequency actually has a higher species observed than the on-trail frequency. So that's good, but what do we do with that? Like, I can't go to my director and say no more trails. It's one of the top 3 initiatives for parks that people constantly request. We want access. We want to see these great things. So what do we do with that? And we're really hoping to use this information to better guide policy within parks and how we develop parks and conserve parks. So this on the bottom left is a screenshot of the Trails Master Plan from 2016. And on the right, we have the proposed trail alignment for Bennett Creek. So when we go to develop these parks, we're going to start running more in-depth analysis. Earlier, I had mentioned on trail was considered within 50 meters of a trail. So that technically makes up an area, right? So you can start calculating acreage of trails, and then we can look at percent of area developed and impact of species occurrences, if that makes sense. So we might find a sweet spot of like 40% by acreage in a park is ideal for species conservation and access. That is like the direction that we're going to better guide how we're developing parks, which might seem kind of boring, but that's like my whole job. So I find it really exciting. Don't worry, people are still getting trails, but we're also hoping to, save some bird habitat. Like we're really trying to conserve stuff here, but still have that balance of recreation and conservation. Am I able to? Oh. Okay. Future directions, kind of as I said about the trail use, we're also looking at evaluating how natural resource management projects impact bird species assemblages. So like we do a lot of non-native invasive plant removal. We also do meadow restoration now. So we're starting to get a baseline of what the bird species assemblages are and seeing how they improve or change over time based on these surveys. We're also determining, trying to better understand population responses to that manipulation. And we're going into more in-depth habitat typology. So earlier, some of that, one of the tables you saw had like open, forested, or both as like a habitat description. And as you can imagine, that's not very specific for any kind of management other than a bird's eye view, literally, of what's going on the ground. So we're trying to utilize, I don't know if we go to the next slide. We're trying to utilize part of the state wildlife action plan. So they have these crazy appendixes. If you ever have the time to look at them, this is like chapter 3 or 4, and it describes where you can find species of greatest conservation need and what habitat they'll be found in. So we're going to use that presence absence model I talked about and get more specific. So instead of saying open, forested, or both, it'll start being oak hickory forest based on these species that were observed, to get quite a bit more specific and partner that with some of our on the ground vegetation surveys as well. So our new site selection, we looked at where we're doing vegetation management, that non-native invasive removal, as well as rare threatened endangered species occurrences, deer management, our biodiversity and best natural areas, which are typically very unique habitat that we have within the county. The new sites that we have, there's 12 sites, 139 survey sites. One of them is going to be a newly developed park out in Poolsville called Broad Run. Well, it's Royce Hansen at Broad Run Conservation Park. It's a mouthful, but that's out in Poolsville. We'll be surveying that one. And how you can get involved. So I do have, I got to put this little pitch in here. This is still work. So if you have an interest in helping out with our surveys, I like to think it's a great time. My volunteers get Christmas cookies or holiday cookies every single year because I adore them and they do a lot of hard work for me. But right now, a lot of our in-person survey spots are filled, but we do have openings for that acoustic analysis I mentioned. And the great thing about that is it's on your own time. So once we have the acoustic files, we send them out in like late June, early July, and then you pretty much have until August, September to analyze and send us back your data. So if you're interested, please contact me. I think Emily can put my information somewhere that you guys have it, or my co-program administrator, Guy Metzler. He can also help get you updated. I want to say special thanks. Guy couldn't be here. He helps me run this whole program. We pretty much are interchangeable. Also Carter Hughes, who's like my analytics guy, definitely helped a bunch. And this is a list of our volunteers who completely made this project happen. I've been wanting to do this since 2012 and finally had the backing and the people to do it. So it's very exciting. And also my dog, because this program started when COVID happened. So she was my main field companion during all that. And yeah, do you guys have any questions? Yep.
So how do you decide forest needs trails? How do you determine how much activities can be versus how many that might happen?
So the question was, how do we decide how much trails, right? Like whether trails wow and the destruction it will cause. Well, unfortunately for me, master plans for the county and the trail connections have been in place since like the 1980s. So there's some of that I can't fight. A lot of how much trails has to do with the activity, the community ask, and the activation in the area. So for example, the new Poolsville site, there's an interest to partner with the high school so that they can run 5Ks and cross country. So we have to kind of provide loops for that to meet community needs. So oftentimes it is, what does the local community want from that area? Because we're a public agency funded by pretty much everyone in this room. So it's really what you guys want, and then balancing that need with conservation as well. Oh, so. Mm-hmm.
And I know that part of it's going to be further developed, and I was wondering if this kind of data is informing those decisions.
Yes, so the question was, how is data like this being utilized for Wheaton Regional Park and how this data is going to inform those decisions? So interesting enough, Wheaton Regional is actually on our list of parks to do next. Unfortunately, we didn't get in there before the plan decisions came through. What it'll probably evaluate at this point, we'll utilize existing bird data from like eBird and Breeding Bird Survey and compare that with our data set afterwards to see how impacts have changed it. With regional parks in particular, there's a rule in place that we try to follow, which is they can only be developed like 1/3 of the acreage and 2/3 of it has to be conservation. So we really try and beat that into them, but we're also falling back on this to say, get the trails out of the forest interior or move them to the edge of it if you can. So that's kind of how we're pushing those decisions along at somewhere like Wheaton. And some of the undeveloped parks like Bennett Creek and Royce Hansen in particular will use the data we've collected as baseline data. We're obviously going to recommend do the least amount of development possible, but we can also go back and survey at later points in time to say, okay, you developed it, this is what happened. So we're going to follow either what we asked you to do worked great, or we need to change how we're recommending. So it is unfortunately a little bit of trial and error, but we are trying to stay ahead of it. Yep.
Last question in the beginning, when you look at the trails, some of the trails are maybe inside forests, so they may not be so easy, depending on what kind of the day we're testing there. But for example, in Wheaton, there are picnic areas as well, so those are definitely much more, really separate from the forest or from the meadows. So how do you take that into account? Because the development, I know that some of the the people in the Montgomery Parks wanted to this was being there that it's food trucks, it's you know how.
So, okay, so the question is kind of looking at Wheaton and developed versus undeveloped area and park active in use. Is that correct? So we made sure that when we designed these surveys, we were including some of the developed areas as well. Because what we were saying earlier about presence absence, like those developed areas are still supporting birds in some sense, maybe not the birds we want. But we're also trying to establish that baseline in the developed areas to say, okay, this is generally what we're seeing over here. And if we want to conserve that forest area, like these are the impacts you're going to have. So when we delineated some of those sites as being forest interior versus forest interior, so edge forest, that has implications on species assemblages that we'll also be including when we make recommendations to our greater planning team in those parks. And we won't. So it's an interesting point you bring up about activation because we have wanted to look at trail use in particular because trail use at somewhere remote like Rachel Carson Conservation Park greatly differs from Wheaton Regional Park. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but that on-trail versus off-trail analysis was a step in the right direction because we do have off-trail sites down county as well. So we're trying to cover the broad spectrum of that to start including some of the use. There's a partner project going on about park use that this is kind of creepy, but it uses your cell phone data. And like anytime someone opens their phone in parks, it like submits a location to this crazy data set. It's called like Park Stat or like City Stat that someone collects the data. So we're starting to try and partner that with the bird data to be like, okay, people are using their phones maybe to use iNaturalist or Seek or Merlin or whatever in the park. And submitting that to start getting a park use idea and overlaying it with this data set. But that's a project for Dianna 2 years from now, like a year from now. I had to prove the project first.
Preservation of the animals. What happens when you find something that indicates that some of these particular birds that inhabited or stayed, like those hollow out trees that you mentioned, if you have some owls, what if those trees start to disappear, they're fallen, or damaged? What type of actions can I take to either replace that type of structure or to take care of the environment?
Mhm.
So the birds.
So the question is, what other conservation things like dead trees, hollow trees? Is that correct? So what we do currently is nothing, unfortunately. So part of that is because when emerald ash borer came through in 2018, we actually got a lot of standing deadwood. So that really did the job for us because ash trees, we're a Stream Valley Park system. So ash trees are pretty much in every single park. But when we do part of my inventory job is forest stand delineation. And one of the high quality factors is standing deadwood. You know, is there standing deadwood? Is there down logs because of wildlife habitat? So we'll note that. We've had talks with our about something they call there's a technical term for it, but it's basically like you're aging a young tree to provide hollows and stuff like that. Some research has gone on in England about damaging growing trees to try and provide wildlife habitat that is quickly disappearing from dead trees falling rapidly in some of these urban forests. We haven't deployed those techniques yet, only because you can, everybody wants to save trees. No one wants to hurt trees. So we haven't quite gotten there yet, but also because we haven't needed to in that specific sense. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is, what kind of input do we give to meadow management about when they cut, when they should be cutting at places like Woodstock and Low Screen? Is that right? So interestingly enough, I also manage our meadow program. So specifically, because of birds and nesting bird season, we give them recommendations that they should only be cutting those sites between February 1 and the end of March. That's like the absolute latest that they are allowed to be doing it. And we really encourage them to do it in February so that they're standing winter habitat, but they aren't going into the nesting bird season. That's like the very baseline of management that we do. We are starting to recommend a lot more intensive management practices like strip mowing so we can preserve insect species that might have egg cases that haven't hatched yet. We're also talking about rotational mowing. So at Low Screen is a great example where they used to do only 1/3 of all the meadow sites in a given year would get cut to prevent woody species growth. We also started an in-house prescribed burn program this year. It was the first time we did that. There's a lot of rules and regulations with that. So I'm not sure what'll happen with that, but that's another approach we might look at. And we're really trying to get very specific recommendations. Some of these meadow management areas, though, some regions like our facility operations, they only have 12 acres, whereas other management regions have 500. So getting them all on the same page about when to do it and how to do it isn't as easy as like giving them one prescription. So hopefully they should be only cutting between February and March 31st as of now. The only difference is our hay management sites. So we have hay leases that are mushroom hay, and those are also formatted to try and avoid peak breeding bird timeframe. So they aren't allowed to cut those until I think it's after July 1st. Might be after July 1st or July 15th, trying to avoid the peak nesting bird timeframe. Does that answer that?
Yeah. That's the only thing I don't understand. When is the ideal time to mow meadows? And, yeah, if not.
Yes, ideally. So if I had it my way, we would utilize strip mowing because then there's a lot more intact standing grown habitat. But come about early May, a lot of that material should be about knee high, if not a little bit taller. So we are seeing some bird species, but I think certain sites we're going to have specialized management prescriptions based on what we're looking for. So some of them we might be looking to manage for grasslands if it meets 40 acres and could support something like bobwhite. So like that is a very specific recommendation that we'll give to a very specific site. But we're not there yet. So I've been working on the meadow program for at least 8 years now, and it's slowly been getting everybody on board and everybody on the same page. And now I got to send out Xerces Society recommendations about best management. So we'll get there.
But do that. Mow half the meadow, Jason's meadow, and do recordings at the same time, roughly the same time in mowed meadows and not before you then go to the rest. Okay.
I like that idea, and Low Screen is on our list this year. So I might have to employ that next mowing season. So I'll have to bring that up with them because they shouldn't be mowing that whole site, but we'll see if I can get them on board. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Speaking of Low Screen, it has a lot of people been there. It's been mowed bush off flat. That correct?
Yes. Yep.
So, okay, so there were a lot of invasive, no question about it, but that was also good bird habitat, field sparrows. You know, is your all, that'd be great if you all have funds and dedication to trying to restore grass.
Mm-hmm.
That way it works. Previous education growth up again for the next policy.
So the question is, are we going to actively start restoring some of these meadow sites? And the answer is yes. So we've started a pilot project out at Rachel Carson Conservation Park, where that was kind of us figuring out how much money is it going to cost to completely get rid of the invasives at a site, seed the whole thing, and manage it in perpetuity. What kind of cost are we talking about here, and what is it going to take? How long is it going to take? Rachel Carson was the first example. If you guys have any time, I highly recommend you go out there throughout this season just to see. Yeah, the front meadow in particular is going to look very good because that project started in 2021. The back 8 acres is currently under restoration, so that one's going to look a lot younger visually than the other one. But we are starting to figure that out. It's just a money question because even Rachel Carson's only 30-acre meadow, and already it's easily cost us $80,000. So it's not cheap, and lowest green is 100 acres. So I want to get there, but I have to find funding and also management, like the duff layer that remains. So we recommend they cut 6 to 8 inches high annually with like a flail mow so that there's some intact grasses and they're not completely scalping a site. The problem is like that, there's a duff layer that accumulates that suffocates all the native plants. Ideally, you strip mow way lower than that so you have intact and then really cut, or you burn. We can't burn at a place like Lowest Green because it's right next to an airport. Like you have to be 1,500 feet away from an occupied dwelling. And as you can imagine in Montgomery County, that is few and far between. So we're figuring out those logistics because there's no point in throwing money at it until we're able to long-term maintain it. So we're getting there, I promise. But Rachel Carson is a great place to start if you have an interest in some of that work. There's also more on the Parks website as well about restoration projects. The question is, how do you keep invasives out? And don't we all want to know? It's dedicated effort. It's prolonged effort. Some of the concentrated attempts that we are working on right now, we will go to areas that are already pretty high quality and start getting rid of them there and then pushing out, which means going back to the same area every single year, year after year after year, retreating that area and just kind of expanding as you get it under control. It's job security. I will be treating invasives for the rest of my life. But it is a job in persistence. So some of these areas I've seen since I was 16 and seeing them now, it is night and day, but you wouldn't realize it because there's so many invasives, but we're making good progress. I promise. Anybody else? Yes.
The old land underwent by Department of Environmental Protection. Will that be turned over in 2025 to Montgomery Parks?
The question is, will Goody landfill be turned over to Parks? I don't know. I know Goody and Oaks landfill in particular are of interest. I have an interest in Oaks because of, I think it's the short-eared owls. Yeah. So we have an interest in making sure those areas get protected, but there's a lot of problems that come with landfill from like an off-gassing, pollution, leaching, maintenance cost. So I don't know. Be on the lookout. I'm not sure. Does anybody else have questions online? Cool. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
It was wonderful. Thank you.